All right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Lucille Eber. I live in Illinois, and I worked with and I actually initiated the Illinois PBIS network about 18 years ago. We're one of the first state PBIS networks. And before that, we were a more emotional behavior disabilities network focused on kids with mental health problems, system of care, and wraparound. And along with Kelly and Susan, we're the leads for mental health integration with PBIS for the National PBIS Center. And we're very excited to be here. And we're excited about who's in the room here today, because who's in the room here today represents the symmetry that you need to make systems change. You have state level participants. Let's see hands for people who work at the state level. Casey's pointing at people. Okay, over there. Okay, she wants you to raise your hand. Okay, so we have some of our state leaders, and then how many of you work at the district level? Great, and there's district leadership that's needed, and then how many of you work at the building level? Great. So the integration that we're going to talk about in terms of integrating mental health within a PBIS or MTSS system, actually needs to be, for the best impact, leadership from the top and symmetry between the integration efforts at the state level down to the building level. So we're pretty excited to be here with the Nevada team in this regard. So we've done our welcome. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but a couple years ago, seems like a long time ago, right, Susan? NPR ran an online series about the silent epidemic mental health crisis in our schools. I think this was 2016, so it's only 2 years ago. And even in the past 2 years, the escalation of normal mainstream people, not just educators and mental health clinicians, about this crisis is increasing. So our goals here today are related to the fact that mental health in schools, let me jump ahead for a minute, is, actually, no, let me go back. All right. The mental health in school needs to be everybody's job. So you're all here. And so the goals that we have for the 2 days is for you to understand how to enhance your current or your developing MTSS system with mental health becoming a part of it, not a separate system that we hand some kids off to. We're really about creating an integrated system. We're hoping you walk out of here with some strategies today. And as Ashley said, we know all your team members aren't here, and you're going to need to repeat some of these teaming activities and perhaps share some of this information and rely on your state PBIS team to help you with that. And of course, the goal for all of us is to build capacity so that MTSS, PBIS, includes mental health, and everybody is feeling, I use these two words, competent and confident, all the way down to the classroom level, where teachers don't feel anxiety when they find out a student is struggling with anxiety. Where teachers don't feel depressed because other kids have depression. They feel confident and competent in what their role is in supporting kids who are struggling to learn more functional behaviors. So this setup here that I'm going to do with you for a few minutes is about the context and the rationale. Susan came upon a new report, and it's the same data. So we've been sharing this data for 7 or 8 years now. The sad part is the statistics are getting a little bit worse. So I'll go back to that in a moment. But this is a current principals concerns. And if you can see the top two up here, increase in the number of kids with emotional problems, student mental health issues, 73.7, 65.5. Those are the leading top principal concerns today. Our principals here, do you have? So, and then right after that is academic achievement. So there's a growing understanding that mental health concerns and emotional behavior concerns are actually part of our concerns about academic achievement. They do need to be addressed if we want all kids to succeed in school. A little bit more on this study. This is the Journal of Pediatrics 2016. 37% increase in the number of teens suffering from a major depressive disorder. That's a pretty big jump. There's all kinds of reports out there, all kinds of articles. This just happens to be the one that we're sharing with you today. But these are pretty prevalent facts. Depression and suicide are actually increasing in the number of kids who are impacted by them over the past couple years. When we started using statistics like this in our initial work with integrating mental health in schools, suicide was the 4th leading cause of death of teenagers and young adults. It's now the 2nd leading cause of death, only second to accidents, which includes a high number of things, right? So we are struggling with the prevalence rates, especially with our young adults, but also with older adults as well. A report from the Child Mind Institute, 74.5 million children, estimated over 17 million have or had a psychiatric disorder. What this kind of boils down to in the classroom is you can expect 1 in 5 kids in every classroom to have or to develop during their school years a need for some level of emotional and behavioral support. So it's not something that only a few people in schools are going to address. And so here's some of the statistics, if you're curious, by age range and by rank order. And you can see the suicide ones are the ones that's the 55 to 64 year. If you can't see, this first one is 10 through 14, 15 through 24, 25 through 34, second leading cause of death. And only maybe 8 years ago, it was the 2nd leading cause of death. I'm not exactly sure which year it changed, but it only reinforces the conclusion of the 2016 NPR story that we were thrilled to see mainstream media addressing this issue so upfront. So in schools, mental health needs to be everybody's job. How many people in this room have a job title that would be considered under the generic category of clinician? School psychologist, keep your hands up. School psychologist, counselor, now they're coming. School social worker, okay. All those would be clinical jobs. It is no longer just those job titles that are in charge of supporting, preventing, and helping ameliorate concerns related to mental health. It has to be everybody's job. And that's the wonderful thing about the MTSS PBIS system, is it creates a system based on data and using teams of decision makers where a variety of expertise sits at the table together, looks at the data, and uses your collective knowledge to decide what to do. No longer do we want to do the hand off to one person who carries a caseload as an expected to, quote, fix those kids, right? Because we are not seeing the outcomes from the handoff model. What we need are more systemic approaches. We put together this monograph on the interconnected system framework. It's kind of a mouthful to describe the integration of mental health right into the PBIS framework. And this monograph came from, well, let's look at the dates up here, about how long we've been working on this, just to give you a little background. Starting as early as 2002, some of us who have mental health backgrounds, Susan and myself on the national team, were working with sites around the country who wanted a more impactful mental health focus in their PBIS system. And things started to mushroom. We wrote our first white paper on this in 2008, the PBIS Center and the Center for School Mental Health. We started working together, putting presentations together, submitting grants together. And in September 2013, so that's 5 years ago, we put out the first electronic monograph where we brought people, Kelly was one of them, from around the country who were already trying to work the mental health piece into their PBIS. We brought them all to a hotel in Chicago. We put them in rooms. We put the researcher leaders from the PBIS Center and the Center for School Mental Health, who I might add didn't know each other at the time. So you have George Sugai leading the Center for School Mental, PBIS, and Sharon Hoover was the head of the Center for School. They wrote chapters together. I always called it our little secret field-based intervention. Now I'm on video saying that. But it was really a field-based intervention in terms of bringing the leaders and researchers from the two separate centers together with practitioners like Kelly in the Scranton School District that you were working with at the time, who were struggling and learning about how to integrate these systems. And things have only mushroomed since then. We finally have our first random control trial study. It's almost over, the first one. And the good news is we are seeing improvements in the overall school climate, the overall PBIS implementation, as well as outcomes for kids when adding in an integrated mental health component that I'll describe to you a little bit more. There's plenty of resources online. If any of you are self-learners, self-starters, and not going to wait for Casey and Jody to show up and you want to do some further learning, if you go to midwestpbis.org, click on content, find ISF or mental health. There's all kinds of recorded webinars. We've been doing 8 to 9 a year for probably 3 years with different practitioners on various topics such as blended teams, funding, screening, database decision making, et cetera. So there's plenty of resources. And what we want to work with in terms of the Nevada group, we're very excited about the leadership from your state team with your AWARE grants, your school climate transformation grants, and we're looking at a state structure, and this is some of the discussion we've been having through webinars with your state PBIS leaders and in terms of the integration and building a state structure with aligned mission, vision, and goals and understanding how to move forward with demonstration sites. And I think we could consider the people in this room, do they know their demonstration sites, pilot sites, where you're going to get the focused effort from the state team so as to build the capacity of the Nevada team for what Susan and Kelly and I call our utopian world. In our utopian world, when people do PBIS, MTSS, it's automatic that their mental health partners from the community are sitting at the table with them, and that mental health providers from the community, not just the school, are sitting on teams in the building, looking at data, bringing community data around trauma and other impactful events to the school and helping plan a full integrated continuum so that we don't have separate PBIS, MTSS, and when we don't know what to do, we hand them off to the mental health folks. We have not seen the outcomes from separate systems, and we've seen some very exciting and positive efforts on the PBIS side using the system structures of PBIS. So we're moving forward using those same system structures. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Susan and Kelly and I, after the Parkland shooting in Florida, of course, we're glued to all the news stories because there's always kids with unmet mental health needs behind all these horrific events. But we were struck the Sunday morning after of the comments from the superintendent from the Broward school system, because what he said sounded to us exactly like the message we're giving you, is we need a systemic integration. We don't just need new people added to separate systems. We have to actually change the systems that we're working in so that we can be more efficient and ensure the impact for all kids. So we felt like this quote, they're working in more integrated and collaborative fashion. We need to work in more integrated and collaborative fashion to ensure we can share data, share information to enhance our level of effectiveness. I think folks are working as hard as they can, but we're working in silos. Better integration in support of that would be helpful. And so we felt like that was a good kind of capsizing of the messages here. Now, there's more big picture challenges besides the statistics we shared with you on the increasing rates of depression and anxiety and the high prevalence rates of kids with emotional behavior and mental health issues. Some of the other big picture challenges have to do with some of the, let's call them the less than effective intervention systems that have been in our schools that we have to sometimes face and say what we've been doing for kids with real significant behavior and emotional problems hasn't been working. We've seen a lot of low intensity, low fidelity interventions, and we've seen people use placements that are segregated and restrictive as an intervention in their minds. If I put this child over here, something different will magically happen because those people are certified differently than I am. The outcomes are not there, right? And for kids to learn new ways of functioning and replacement behaviors for some of the chronic misbehaviors, simply putting them in separate places, which has been done. A lot of the times the schools think they've done their job by placing a child. But when you look at the outcomes and when and how those kids come back into settings, we realize that that is definitely not the answer, right? Again, we're getting a little better at the stigma issue, and we're getting a little better at this issue of high undiagnosed mental health problems. One of the hard parts that is the focus of this workshop today and our work with interconnected system frameworks is actually changing the routines and the procedures in the school building and how people work together and how they make decisions about which interventions to do with which kids and how to monitor them. And that's kind of where the hard work begins. Now, we have a history of school mental health coming up and moving community providers into the schools. But that history has led to kind of ad hoc and weak connections and not a systemic application of mental health, where often mental health is seen as whoever the person who's been assigned to your building is, who has a caseload of kids. And that is not a systemic, preventive, multi-tiered mental health approach. Now, so when we bring the mental health community providers into an integrated system, the questions we want to answer: can we expand the effectiveness of the continuum of interventions if we have different and a broader group of people at the table to work that continuum? Not just individual people who decide on their own what intervention to do with which kids. Sometimes clinicians are choosing interventions just based on their own training or whatever program the agency they're employed by wants them to use. Has anybody ever experienced that, right? What we want is people with strong clinical knowledge sitting at the table, looking at the data, and dialoguing about which intervention we might need to research and design that would have the biggest impact for the presenting problems per the data in front of us. So we actually want to increase the continuum and the effectiveness of it by bringing a broader array of, this is evidence-based practices, sorry for the acronym, to meet the needs of more, quote, clients with greater effectiveness. So can we do that if we have a broader group of people at the table? Now, you're all familiar with the triangle. Is anybody not familiar with the triangle? All right, this is our favorite triangle because it shows that all kids should be accessing Tier 1 in a preventive manner. And what's really important and that you're going to learn about across these 2 days and in your future work is that when some kids need more or different, it's actually added on, not presented over here separately. The link between a Tier 3, let's say, function-based behavior plan and the behavior matrix at Tier 1 is critically important for transference and generalization. We don't want kids to be working with individual clinicians out here, and then they come back into the classroom, and the teacher is unaware of what's happening and how to support that intervention. So we're going to show you actual links between Tier 3 plans and what happens in the classroom through Tier 1, and how teachers can feel more confident and more competent in the classroom with kids that have some significant problems. So the inclusion of kids, all staff, no matter who they work for, and families into one system with full transparency, right? None of this nebulous, I wonder what's happening over there kind of dialogue. That's our goal here. If you want to know why we chose the PBIS framework to help make these improvements with the delivery of mental health, the experimental research is really finally clear. I've been working with the National PBIS Center for over 20 years, and the explosion of proof on how a systemic approach using teams, using data, and ensuring effectiveness at every step of the way. Oh yes, and the science of behavior, right? But the science of behavior has been around since I was a special ed teacher in a basement classroom in the 70s, right? The science of behavior is not new. It's the systemic features that makes the science of behavior effective to produce these kinds of results. Here's Rob Horner's Cliff Notes if you don't want to read all those studies. The reason we're using the PBIS framework is it has proven to actually change the systems and the adult behavior and the adult competency, feeling confident and competent about what their role is with behavior. And now we want to include, for example, anxiety and depression and other more internalizing mental health concerns right inside this framework that's produced these kinds of results. We know that with PBIS, that it provides the solid foundation, but many of us have always known something's missing if you're only using office discipline referrals as your identification for kids who need more, right? Those of us that come up through the kind of mental health side, if you will, on education have always been concerned about that. We also know that many schools are struggling to implement their Tier 2 and their Tier 3. We know that youth with internalizing issues may go undetected. And we also know that there's a broader set of data that in the community that influences what sort of preventive and early intervention kids might need relative to mental health problems. Unemployment rates, incarceration rates, domestic violence rates, right? Opioid use rates, homelessness rates, community data changes impact children's readiness for learning. And schools need to partner with the community people who have their finger on this data and maybe have access to and knowledge of a broad array of interventions. But we don't want the handoff. We want the welcome mat rolled out. We want them sitting on the teams at the district level, sitting on the teams at the building level, and helping broaden our impact. So kids with internalizing issues have been missed. One of our early mental health integration strategies Susan came up with for us from, was it Virginia? Might have been a Virginia school, was number one, and you could do this when you go back instantly. You don't even have to, you can just do this through your PBIS team. The team here said, don't call it an office discipline referral, call it a time out of class form. There are a lot of kids who access some kind of reassuring adult and get out of the classroom to do that, but they're not acting out. And those are kids who need some interventions. So counting all out of class time, whether kids are going to see the nurse, going to see a counselor, saying they're not feeling well. The nurse is a big data point for kids with internalizing mental health issues. This is one of our beginning steps and stages of broadening the impact of the PBIS system, is think about all kids, not just externalizing behavior. Think about kids with internalizing behavior as well. So our definition of this interconnected system framework is not a new program. It is not a new system you are developing. It is a structure and process within the PBIS systems that you're installing and implementing. But what it is bringing in community partners, mental health providers, into that system. A real key feature is it is not up to individual principals in individual schools to change how clinicians work together, because there's policy, funding, job descriptions, and personnel issues and professional development issues that impact every building in the district. So we're very adamant about the fact that this structure needs to be led by people with executive level authority at the district level. And we want building people represented on the district leadership teams, but people who are in charge of policy, funding, job descriptions, et cetera, and the memorandums of understanding and the contracting that might happen between agencies and schools have to be in a lead for the interconnected system framework. You have to have the people in authority. Now, if you're doing PBIS through district leadership teams, I think they are, you're already familiar with the fact that each building doesn't make up their own routines around PBIS. So this is similar, but we're bringing new partners to the district leadership team as well as to the building teams. So we really are excited about the Nevada, the symmetry of the process, because our state partners are starting to have conversations about what can change at the state level to support the districts better in partnerships with their community mental health providers. I don't know the answer to that for Nevada, but I know that there are people willing to have those conversations. And I think some of the grant funding that you've received gives you an opportunity to try stuff out and try to move forward with learning that will lead to policy changes. So it's pretty exciting for you all to be the school. Some of you are the school leadership folks. Some of you are the district leadership folks. In some states, we have regional technical assistance centers. I can't remember, we don't have that here in Nevada. We have it in Iowa, we have it in Michigan. It's a big Midwest thing. And of course, your state leadership team. So we have representatives across the board here today to begin to have these conversations. And oh, this is that long, slow one. I gotta get all this, okay, all right, here we go. Now you should be familiar with the PBIS blueprint, and the PBIS blueprint that represents the district structures and the building structures is exactly the same for the interconnected system framework. It's just that there's more people and different partners at all the tables. So this is a very similar process in that your district leaders look up to ensure the system supports needed to ensure the training, coaching, evaluation, feedback, the expertise needed, and then the local implementation demos. Like if you're in a large district like Chicago, Clark County, you don't do it in all schools at one time, right? So you have to have your demo sites where you learn, and then what happens is, and this is a really important little nuance that Susan and I, working on the national team, we wanted these arrows to go both ways. I had to fight pretty hard for that one. They were like, why do you want I want the arrows to go both ways. Because what's learned here feeds back in to change how you support future ones, and the leadership team needs to have the feedback this way, and the schools need to have the support that way. So this is a similar process, but we're going to insert different people into it when we do interconnected system framework. Again, there'll be some beginning steps that you can take if MOUs or memorandums of agreement aren't in place yet. So you can be schools just getting started with PBIS, and you can bring the mental health in at the same time. That's our future world, right? This would be a natural part of building a behavioral health system in your schools. But most around the country, with over 26,000 schools documented through the PBIS National Center as implementing PBIS, we know that there's a lot of districts and schools where you have already got the PBIS structures in place, and you'll be bringing in different partners into it, right? And so one of the things we've seen through the early descriptive, not to be published yet, but will be someday, results from our random control trial study is a boost in the PBIS implementation now that they have the clinicians on the teams at Tier 1 and Tier 2, not being simply Tier 3 people. So it can come in at any point in time. Now, the interconnected system framework is actually what we call an alignment process. And in an alignment process, if you want some resources on this, we have some listed in some later slides, but you always lead with an executive level team. And this executive level team of different people from different initiatives, and some people need to do this within the district not just with the community partners. So bully prevention, SEL, PBIS, restorative practices, trauma-informed care. What am I missing, right? Those need to be aligned through one team at the district level. How would you like to be a teacher who goes to trauma training on Tuesday, restorative practices on Wednesday, and we have our PBIS regular training next week Friday? And they get back to their classroom and nobody's told them what they're supposed to do to integrate all of these. That comes from the district level or from the state training team to ensure that people know how to integrate. And we're going to give you examples of this alignment as we go through, right? But it's all led through teaming structures. Here's a great example. This comes from some of Kelly's work in Pennsylvania in the early days of the Interconnected System Framework. But they did have, this is an acronym because these words take up too much space on the slide, District Community Leadership Team, meaning they'd already expanded their district PBIS team to have mental health providers. They were having a dialogue about what's going on with the kindergartners, right? Anybody else had that dialogue, right? That's a national dialogue. They were having it in terms of many more behavior problems, many more kids being excluded from school, teachers saying kids were, coming in wilder or whatever it was they were saying. So they had a dialogue and they made some decisions. One was to drill down with more training for the kindergarten teachers to teach them how to do function-based interactions on a real day-to-day basis. Like, in other words, enhance the tier 1 for the kindergartner teachers and teach them about function so that they can change some of their interactions before responding to kids. And then the community end of it, they also talked about individual kids and families that might need to receive this parent-child interactive therapy, which they researched, they brought back to the table, and proposed it to this combined team of school district and mental health providers. As opposed to sending some kids to mental health, they're trying to solve the problem in a truly integrated and collaborative way. And then they're monitoring it. They're like, those one-way mirror things are pretty expensive. We missed a lot of kids because of that, right? Or we're not sure exactly on the outcomes. Let's clean up the evaluation of that. And then how do we give additional coaching and technical assistance to ensure fidelity? Fidelity is a big discussion in the PBIS world from day one. When I learned PBIS in 1998, where were you in 1998? When I learned PBIS in 1998 from George Sugai, he had the first fidelity tool that ended up being the SET, that we don't even use that much anymore. He trained us as coaches and trainers off the fidelity tool. Because from the beginning, the PBIS originators knew that training wasn't enough, that you had to make sure people were actually implementing the behavioral components as the research showed them to work. A little bit will not give you the same impact. So again, we're now bringing that discussion into the mental health end of service delivery, which we all find very exciting. Now, the core features of MTSS, that are the core features of PBIS, are all present in this interconnected systems approach that we're talking about here today. But they're a little different. So the teams have different people on them. The data extends to community data. The evidence-based practices, doesn't matter who's delivering it. If you're a mental health clinician on a contract working in a school to deliver an intervention of a different high-level clinical nature, you are under the same discussion of accountability and evidence base. Why are we using that intervention for this presenting problem? Is there enough evidence to indicate we're likely to get an effect, and how long should it take? What's the dosage? What's the frequency? Just like with check and check out or your social skills instructional group. It applies, the evidence-based practice features apply to all the interventions. Screening, in the early days of PBIS, our screening was simply office discipline referrals. About maybe 10 years ago, we moved to screening for internalizing and externalizing. And now the screening world has mushroomed and taken off, and there's all kinds of tools for screening with anxiety, screening for depression, screening for a range of internalizing mental health disorders. Same feature, but enhanced. Same thing with progress monitoring, same thing with coaching. Critical features of PBIS that need to be present. A way we dialogue about this that might be helpful for you to get your head around it is we often say, what's the traditional approach we've seen with mental health in schools, and what does the integrated approach look like? And so, for example, I've already mentioned kids being seen. Notice the quotes around that, because we don't want caseload. I'm seeing somebody. We don't even like to use the term counseling and therapy because they're not clear enough. How many different forms of counseling and therapy are there? So to say the kid's in counseling or being seen by somebody, already you're removed 2 steps further away from the accountability aspect of how do we know that intervention is matched for that presenting problem, and how will people know exactly what we're doing? Are we doing a solution-focused problem-solving approach? Are we teaching a kid a replacement behavior for cutting or for running away? What is it we're actually trying to accomplish? What are the intended outcomes? What is the actual interaction involved in the intervention? And what is the dosage, frequency, and methodology for measuring the effectiveness of it, which you do with your behavior interventions. And we want that to extend. So that's what makes mental health everybody's job, because there's a link back down to the classroom. And the evaluation isn't just notes. We have the famous quote we used years ago, and it seems to stick, you know. How's Kelly doing in therapy? Fine. She seems to like it. We get along fine. Okay, we'll keep her in it. 5 years later, Kelly's still in the same nebulously described intervention. Now, that therapist may be doing some very high-level stuff, but nobody really knows what it is, and how are we going to know when we should switch to something else, versus hoping that 10 years later, the relationship will serve her well. That's not good enough. That hope is not good enough for kids and families. Kids and families deserve the accountability of interventions that is now available in the mental health system. So we want to have these clear discussions and move forward in that regard. Here's some examples of types of community data. This is typical school data. These are some of the types of data I mentioned. Kids being arrested, how many families. There's certain neighborhoods in Chicago where the percentage of families involved with child and family services is alarming. And that changes what the preventive tier 1 approaches should be and the family support structures should be inside those schools that are inside that community. So the community data examples are here. Here's an example of a district community leadership team with blended mental health and education partners looking at the increase in hospitalizations for suicidal ideations across the whole county, a county school district. And then they say, well, what are we doing for early identification and prevention? The answer was not much. A counselor here in a certain high school, a clinician here in a certain middle school was trying to do something all on their own. What they needed was a systemic suicide prevention curriculum all the way through tier 3 with people trained on how to interact with kids they thought were at risk to assess it, but all the way down to the health curriculums inside the school. So just to kind of summarize our key messages around this interconnected system framework. Number 1, single system of delivery. Number 2, access is not enough. Outcomes are critically important. And that message came from the fact that we're constantly coming up against systems, even federally funded grants, that only expected the schools to count referrals. How many kids did we refer to a clinician? That would be like saying how many kids went to reading class was an indication of kids knowing how to read, right? We want to apply the same rigor we apply to academic interventions to behavioral health, social emotional interventions. So it's not good enough to, quote, be seen or be referred. We want to know how many kids experienced an intervention that produced the intended outcome, and they have an improved quality of life for that. So that takes a little bit more than access. And of course, prevention, mental health is for all, and using our MTSS features. Just a couple comments on each of these as we wind our way into an activity. But what I'd like you to do as an advanced organizer is I would like you to think about similarities and differences in the systems you currently have and the integrated system. Some might think utopian, but we have many communities across the country making great efforts towards this. So what are the similarities and differences? You might already be thinking of them. But as I quickly review through the key messages, I want you to think about that, because no system starts from a blank slate. You're all doing something relative to kids' social, emotional health, mental health, right? You've got some system features, many of you from your PBIS implementation. So under single system of delivery, at the district level as well as the building level, one committed functional set of teams with authority guides the work, right? And the goal is for mental health to be at all tiers, to be represented, not just waiting in the wings for beyond tier 3. Right? But to be part of the entire system. And again, evidence-based practices and programs at each tier, a symmetry of process. Some of you have this. You have a district leadership team already, and you have teams at the building level. Some of you may already have some relationships with mental health providers, but they might not be on the teams yet. So this is how we want you to start thinking. What pieces do you already have that could move towards an integrated system? Now, the plan should be social emotional strength capacity across all the staff, and the staff feeling competent and confident relative to mental health, and being able to support the intervention, even if it's tier 3, when the kid's in the classroom, by their tier 1. Not necessarily having to create new things for the kid, but being able to adapt the check and check out process or the tier 1 reinforcement system to help support whatever the tier 3 need is. And again, with the single system of delivery, maybe some of you have already had some expansion of the types of data that you look at. And that would be, there may already be some agreement in your community around a data point that you now want to formally create this district community leadership team around. You may have already done screenings, right? Now, we do have a tool we're going to introduce you to a little bit over these 2 days that's directly linked to the PBIS tiered fidelity inventory. People are familiar with that? How many of you know the TFI? It's the PBIS-TFI, right? The Tiered Fidelity Inventory. What we've done through our national work group team a few years ago is we took that TFI and every item on it, we added an item. You don't have to score the item. We don't have scoring anchors, although some of our sites are working on that. It's just for planning. If you want, and so this is the one on teaming, the teaming composition for the TFI. The ISF enhancement is bringing families, students, and community partners onto the team. So you'll be able to, through your TFI process, pick which items would be good for you to move forward on. And that's the one related to single system of delivery. When you get into a single system of delivery, you need to expect that there's going to be changes. Now that you have different people on the teams and all the interventions are going to be talked about, and we're going to expect the same level of evaluation, accountability, and database decision making with all the interventions, it's going to change perhaps meeting times. It's definitely going to change who's at the table, might change the agendas. Again, the language in a single system of delivery, we want to move away from generic terms when we're making plans about which interventions to use with kids and have open discussions. That's going to be changed. Clinicians who previously just delivered interventions maybe helping with system discussions at Tier 1 and Tier 2, even if they're not delivering the interventions. That may be a change. We know that there will be change involved when you move into a single system of delivery. Here's an example from a site in New Hampshire, and it's all their PBIS stuff, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. This was one thing they added when they moved to an integrated single system. Instead of the kids being sent to the clinician from the community because of anxiety, they made a decision to include a Tier 2 intervention called Coping Cat right in their multi-tiered system. So that's an example of a single system of delivery. Under access is not enough. That's my favorite message. Kelly and Susan know that. So I've already talked about that a little bit in terms of what our frustrations were, that access is definitely not enough. We need to focus on the outcomes. The discussion at the team level is, are the interventions matched to the presenting problem? Are the teams and staff explicit about the intervention discussion? And are the prompts and the pre-corrects part of, in the classroom, part of the way to measure the outcomes? Here's an example of an early one from Illinois that I was involved with down in central Illinois. And there was a community clinician on the team. This was about 8, 9, maybe 10 years ago, before everybody was talking about trauma in schools. People were not talking, believe it or not, that much about trauma in school 10 years ago. But the clinician from the community who joined the teams had just been through training on it. And they were looking at data, and they were saying that the clinician said, you know, I just went to this workshop on trauma, and I think you need a trauma-informed intervention at Tier 2. And she helped put it together, taught it to the school social workers, and they have it continuing in that high school, taught by school staff to this day.